You know, dear viewers, it really has been a while since I've uploaded anything on this channel. Just roughly about 2 months. I guess you can say that my channel's been in the comatose state. When the fuck did that get there? What is up, everyone? It is Reviews Kingdom, and today I have no pen. But in other good news, I am finally back after a 2-month long hiatus. A 2-month long hiatus of me being in a creative slump. And to get myself out of this slump, I am doing the only rational thing I can do, and that is going back down to the Skillet Retrospective. And to some, that might not really seem that rational, but to me, it helps me get back in the working mood, and it really just gets me pumped up to do more reviews. And I don't know why it's specifically Skillet, but hey, at least I'm getting back in the swing of things, and that's always good, right? But yes, we are going back on down to the Skillet Retrospective, and in this edition, we are going to be taking a look at the 6th studio album by Skillet, which is entitled Comatose, which came all the way back in 2006. Now, in this last edition of the retrospective, we took a look at the 5th studio album, Collide, which came out in 2003. And if you want a quick recap of what I thought about that album, I actually thought it was actually a pretty solid album, all things considered. It's nothing groundbreaking, don't get me wrong. It was nothing groundbreaking, but for Skillet standards, yeah, it was absolutely groundbreaking. But we're going to see in this edition of the retrospective if Skillet continues to improve on their craft. Will they make an album that's even better than Collide, or will it be even worse than the last 4 albums before Collide? Well, that's what I'm here to find out. I'm here to find out if Comatose is a worthy addition to the Skillet catalog. So, without further ado, let's take a look at Skillet's Comatose. We took a look at the 5th studio album, Collide, and much to my surprise, it really wasn't that bad of an album. I would go as far as to say that it was actually a pretty solid album, held together by some pretty rough production, punchy guitar riffs, and melodies, and some genuinely solid songwriting from the songs. Needless to say, while it not being a perfect album, it was definitely a step in the right direction for Skillet, as now it seems that they found their niche, and they have a solid and strong foundation of what works and what doesn't. Now fast forward 3 years later, and Skillet would have yet another album on their hands, as 2006 saw the release of their 6th studio album, Comatose. And it's with this album that Skillet started to finally get a little bit of recognition on the map, as songs like Comatose and Whispers in the Dark would catch on by music goers and critics alike. And, most importantly, these hits would be the subject of many countless AMVs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This is commonly referred to by Skillet fans to be one of their best albums to date, if not the best. Me personally, this is the album that I'm most nostalgic for, as this album and Awake are albums that I listened to almost every day when I was younger. But is this album really the best Skillet album, or is it even as great as I remember? Well, that's exactly what I'm here for. Let's take a look at Skillet's Comatose. Now, right off the bat, it's pretty clear from the first few seconds of the opening track Rebirthing that this album is going to take a different approach and tone from that of Collide. It's pretty evident that the tone isn't as rough or punchy as Collide was, but don't take that as a bad thing. This album feels a lot more bigger and grander in production than any other Skillet album up to this point. The sound of the violin, the piano mixed in with the symphonics, and the shredding guitar make up for one grand sounding album. The album feels a lot more polished in comparison to other albums, and it works very well. Now, while production-wise, this album does kind of stray away from Collide's raw and punchy sound, it still keeps most of the themes of that album alive and well. Right off the bat, this album is very sentimental in nature, providing lyrics and stories about the past and its many ups and downs. And for the most part, it's really something that I'd like to see, because Skillet is going out of their comfort zone and testing the waters with more personal and introspective themes of trauma, abuse, and triumph amongst all things. It's not the deepest interpretation, but at the very least, Skillet tried to diversify their themes and ideas, and it pays off very well for the band in the end. Like I mentioned before, it's not a super deep exploration into these themes, but it gets the job done in making a pretty good and consistent tone. And keeping in line with the previous album, John Cooper brings in yet another okay vocal performance. It's pretty clear from this point on that John is showing off that he finally is confident in showing off his vocal talent. Sure, he's not winning any awards in terms of vocal capabilities, but it's definitely better than what he had to offer in the first 4 albums. His voice is very raspy in nature, and yet there's a bit of vulnerability in his performance that gives off a lot more sincerity in his performance. He doesn't sound bored, and he doesn't sound like he's phoning it in. And while to a lot of people that sounds like the bare minimum requirements of a good vocalist, you'd be surprised to find out that this is a huge blessing when talking about Skillet and John Cooper as a whole. To me, one of the standout songs is The Last Night, where not only does John Cooper sing on this track, but Corey Cooper sings on this track as well. I think that this makes the song work extremely well because of the dynamic that both Corey and John share. It kind of goes hand in hand with the themes of depression and neglect in the song while showing a glimmer of hope at the end of the tunnel. To me, it's one of the best tracks and vocal performances by John Cooper. It kind of makes me wish that we got to hear more of Corey on the vocals, but as time will tell, that wouldn't go on to be the case. But I digress, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves here. So when it comes down to vocal performance, you got the signature rasp, but you also have some moments of versatility and vulnerability, and well, that's pretty much what you'd come to expect at this point coming from Skillet. Now, in terms of lyrical content, what does this album have to offer? As I mentioned before, this album continues the same ideas introduced in Collide, and one thing you'll start to notice about this is the album titles. Starting from Collide through the current album Dominion, they all have this specific theme of rising up. But that's a topic I'll explain later in this retrospective. Going back to Comatose, in terms of lyrical content, much like Collide, it's a major step up from their previous works, which is not to say that these lyrics are groundbreaking or anything, but seeing what we got in the first 4 albums, yeah, it's definitely a step up. If I was to judge the songwriting as a whole, I'd say it's pretty okay. The first half of this album has some pretty solidly written tracks that are memorable enough to stand out and be catchy, and the other half just kind of falls short of that, with 1 or 2 exceptions of course. I've gone over Rebirthing before, but my god is it actually a great track. The song to me not only symbolizes a rebirthing of one's faith, but to me it also symbolically represents Skillet as a whole rebirthing into a new and actually interesting time in their career, as now their stuff has shown to catch on. It's a really great track. The same goes for tracks like Last Night or Comatose. These songs aren't the most complexly written songs you'll hear, but they were written just well enough to stick and resonate with listeners, including myself. The same can't be said for tracks like Yours to Hold or Those Nights. I mentioned before that the first half was pretty well crafted. Well, there's an exception to that, and that exception goes by the name of Yours to Hold. I don't know what it is about this track, but something about it just rubs me the wrong way. On its own, it just sounds like an overly sappy love song about wanting to be noticed and held by someone you care about, but it's not until you read the lyrical content that things start to get a little strange. It's essentially about someone who has deep feelings about someone who doesn't even know they exist, let alone their own name. So basically, the interpretation that I'm getting from this song goes a little something like this. Hey you, yeah you, I'm talking to you. Come over here, let's have a little chat for a bit. Now I know that this is a little weird, we haven't really met each other, I don't know your name, you don't know my name, the basics of people never meeting each other. But I just want to let you know that despite that fact that I can truly be yours and yours alone. Yes, I know it's a little weird, it's a lot to take in, and I also hope you don't pay attention to the fact that I've been watching you from a distance for a long while now, because none of that stuff matters. What truly matters is that I can be yours and yours alone, and I can hold you in my arms, and we can all be peaceful together. Now, will you please accept my gratitude? Yeah, so that's basically the interpretation that I'm getting from this song. Now, you can say in the comments that I have the totally incorrect interpretation of the song, and I'm making a complete ass out of myself, but that's my interpretation. One can also make the argument that it's actually about God watching over someone who's losing faith in religion. And well, yeah, that would be a pretty simple answer because Skillet is a Christian band after all. But it's too simple of an explanation, and I'm looking for the explanations that have the most difficult questions, and by God, does this song raise some very difficult questions? But before I can get ahead of myself, I feel like it's best that I should probably continue on with the review. So yeah, let's just do that instead. Now, I am well and fully aware that I could just be stupid in misinterpreting this, but either way, it's still overly schmaltzy, which outside of lyrical content, it's just kind of a generic love ballad, which is something that Skillet is definitely no stranger to. Now, when it comes down to songs like The Older I Get, or Those Nights, or Say Goodbye, I think my biggest gripe is that Skillet's corniness strikes again, which, again, is nothing new to Skillet. But another problem that I have is that they can be too sentimental, and I think that these three songs really lean heavily on that. The Older I Get and Those Nights are basically just, wow, I'm getting really old, or wow, remember those nights? Those were the times, were they? And in some ways, I do agree, those nights of me listening to Skillet constantly without a care in the world were great times for sure, but it just kind of comes off as cheap nostalgia that's been put in the album that doesn't really say anything. Now, not saying that everything has to have a deeper meaning, of course, but there needs to be at least something of substance that could be looked back upon fondly. Say Goodbye is probably the best of the Sentimental Three, yes, I'm calling them that, but this time, it has a piano. And that's about it. Okay, but in all seriousness though, this song seems to kind of distance itself away from the sappy sentimental lyrics, but it still kind of falls into the same pitfalls as The Older I Get in Those Nights. But I see this song more as moving forward from those moments and prospering into the future to make even greater memories. It's kind of corny, but well, that's just what I've come to expect at this point. At the very least, during the final half of this album, we get bangers like Falling in the Black and Whispers in the Dark, which definitely break through with some catchy songwriting combined with the catchy and symphonic instrumentation at hand. And speaking of which, if there's one thing I can count on being the most tolerable aspects of all these albums, it has to be the instrumentation. Well, that is, unless your album name is Hey You, I Love Your Soul, because then at that point you can fuck right off. But how does the instrumentation stack up against all the other Skillet albums? And well, I will say it isn't as good as Collide, but the band really went in somewhat of a different direction here, as the album is more leaning towards the hard rock genre as opposed to alternative metal. What we got here is a hard rock album that mixes in guitars, drums, symphonics, and violins. Oh, good lord, the violins. These sounds make for a pretty great sounding album that shows off more range in instrumentation and sound by mixing all three of these elements together and cooking up something that it can sound pretty grand in scale at times. I know I keep bringing it up and I apologize sincerely, but Rebirthing is probably one of the most hype I've ever got listening to a Skillet song. The intro with the violins gradually building up to the beats of the drum and then the sound of the guitar make for a pretty euphoric listening experience. The violins come into clutch yet again in the title track Comatose, soothing its way through the entire track. Ben Kosaka, Laurie Peters, and Corey Cooper do a very standout job on this album, giving its own feel and really separating itself from the previous album. It's not their most ambitious work lyrically, but my god does this instrumentation more than make up for this album's flaws throughout the entire album, making it feel as grand and punchy as possible. Granted, much like my problems with the lyrics, the instrumentation can fall a bit short on some of the later half of the album, as it can get a bit generic at times. But to be fair, the lyrics in songs like Those Nights and The Older I Get are very mundane in nature, so I guess it only makes sense that the instrumentation fit the mundane feel as well. I mentioned this before countless times, but I really can't say for certain if John Cooper is a great or even good bassist at times, and for this album it really hasn't changed all that much. But at the very least I can hear the bass in the mix as opposed to it being jam-packed in with every other loud instrument that's being played. I think it's easily one of their best sounding albums, and it's really not hard to see why. It's nothing that's too fantastic, but for Skillet standards, I understand why this album and Collide are as loved as much as they are. I wouldn't consider this my favorite album of all time anymore like I would have when I was a kid, but this is easily one of the best Skillet albums by far. So yeah, to wrap up my final thoughts on Skillet's Comatose, what is the final verdict for this album? And while I gotta say that this album is no high art by any means, don't get it twisted, I still think that this is a pretty solid outing in Skillet's catalog. And I still think it's a pretty solid album overall, all things considered. Now, if you were to ask me if I preferred Collide or Comatose, I would slightly have to give the edge more to Collide. Now, don't get it twisted. While this album is more grand in scale and the songs are a lot catchier, I still think that Collide has a lot more power and it has a lot more punch to it. While this, and like I said before, this album is a lot more grand in scale, and the first half of this album is really good, but I feel like the second half of the album really falls short of that greatness, with songs like Those Nights, The Older I Get, Say Goodbye, and don't even get me started on Yours to Hold. But despite all of its shortcomings, this album is still pretty solid, all things considered. And if you wanted to check it out, well, I would say go for it. You might like it yourself, or you might not like it. I don't really know. Don't take my recommendations if you don't really want to. But regardless of all that, like I said before, this is still a pretty solid album by Skillet, and it has some of Skillet's most iconic songs on this album, such as Comatose, Whispers in the Dark, and my personal favorite, Falling Inside the Black. These songs are definitely one of the most iconic songs in Skillet's catalog, and they definitely put him on the map in terms of popularity. Granted, Skillet was never all about the popularity, they were more about spreading their Christian message, but there's nothing wrong with making a little green on the side, that's what I always say. But regardless of all that, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in another video.